to today's Client Advisory Board call of the Appraisal Institute. Joining us today is Tim Runde, MAI, Lead AP, BB+C with Runde and Partners, Inc. Tim is the president of Runde and Partners, Inc., a full-service real estate appraisal and consulting company. It's headquartered in San Francisco, California. And prior to Runde and Partners, Tim was a partner in Carnegie and Partners, also in San Francisco. Tim is the author of the Appraisal Institute's textbook, The Evaluation of Green Commercial Real Estate, and is fast becoming a subject matter expert in environmental, social, and governance, or ESG-related issues. Tim, thanks for joining us today. We're really interested in hearing your perspectives on ESG in real estate. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for asking me to do this presentation. I want to start with just a little bit of background that I think is relevant to this topic, and I think you'll see how that plays in later. My undergraduate degree was in zoology, and the relevance to this topic is it taught me to understand ecosystems. Ecosystems are limited, have limits. And what we're seeing now with ESG is the manifestation of most of the world realizing that our entire environment is limited. It's not unlimited, and that there are consequences, which economists call externalities, to our behaviors. And what we see with ESG in real estate is that those externalities are now coming back to be charged against the source. And we're going to likely see more of that happen in the future, and how that plays out is yet to be seen. I'm going to start here with a pull quote from a recent ESG report. So just to get started, ESG is environmental, social, and governance issues. We're going to talk a little bit about what that all means. But it's essentially externalities of operations of businesses and real estate in this case. ESG reports are now, they were called sustainability reports, now they're ESG reports. So they're like financial reports, except they're reporting on the metrics and the performance of the entity on these different metrics that heretofore have been considered either do-gooder, optional, window dressing, or just kind of, we want to, put a good look on ourselves or to comply with somebody's requirements. It's becoming much more than that. This is the introduction to the current annual ESG report from Nuveen, who is the advisor to TIAA-CREF. They have over 100 billion in assets under management in the US alone, a lot of real estate. Here's how they let it out. And the point here is that we're at an inflection point. This is from Charles McGinnon, Global Head of Real Estate at Nuveen. Engaging with investors over the last 12 months, we detected two significant shifts in their expectations of their investment managers. First, to meet their fiduciary duty, investors expect material environmental, social, and governance factors to be embedded in investment processes and portfolios. And second, they expect managers to share their values on key issues such as climate change and human rights. The reason I started the presentation with this is two reasons. Number one, there is a shift going on from thinking of ESG being a drag on the finances, and it's something that fiduciary is not part of the fiduciary responsibility, to the fact that the investors expect their fiduciaries to absolutely be considering it. That is a tectonic shift, and that is exactly why Gary Gensler is in front of the head of the SEC, is testifying in Congress, trying to push a rule through that will require corporations to report on their greenhouse gas emissions and climate change risk. Secondly, the fact that, and this has been evolving, investors, customers expect the companies that they do business with, the products they buy, the real estate they occupy, that they actually address these values that are important to them. And we'll see why that is changing as we go through this. In real estate, we typically think of ESG along the lines of a LEED certified building like this Class A office building. High-rise building, LEED Platinum, has the sticker on the door. It's turning out like an Energy Star rated. It has various sustainability things. And this has been the viewpoint of it for a long time, that it's environmental impacts that we're looking at primarily. That too is shifting a bit. The preconceived notion that it's just new buildings, though, is not quite accurate. Here's a building that you can see from that building. You can see the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. This is a 1920s building, sorry, that is also LEED certified. It was gold in 18. It's actually platinum now. And what's relevant here is that this is not a new building. It's an old building. And yet it is every bit as green as the new building that also has the plaque on the wall. It's owned by a company called the Shorenstein Company, a old-time San Francisco family, has a portfolio of real estate up and down the West Coast. And they've been proponents of sustainability in real estate for some time. And I thought this encapsulated pretty well. This quote comes from their current ESG report, and how they define sustainability. And that's sort of the sustainability is the underlying concept under ESG, sustainability, and we'll get to what that actually means in a minute. But they think it means enhancing investment performance, operational resilience, and business governance for the benefit of the company's properties, tenants, employees, investors, and communities. We embrace sustainability as an opportunity to improve our business practices while also reducing our impact on the environment and strengthening the communities where we operate. There's a lot to unpack here, and we'll talk about all how this is so different from the typical all that matters is the financial bottom line approach that business has traditionally taken. And yet that is being debated even as we speak in the public sphere as to whether business really has any business doing this. So what is sustainability? Well, first of all, it's a difficult term to define, but it came out of the 1980s Brundtland report, which was the UN report on sustainable development. They were trying to figure out a way to help companies move out of poverty and into a developed status without destroying the very environment that they were living in. So they came up with this definition, that development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own needs. So what we see is a time equity component to this, that we can't simply leave future generations worse off than we are now. So fast forward to 2015, and the UN released the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And as we see here, there's a variety of them that apply to the social element: no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education. There are some that apply to the development world of building, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production. And there's the climate action, life below water, 17 different areas. These have been adopted by a variety of cities around the world by various government entities. Prior to that, a consultant also came up with another sustainability definition, John Elkington, the triple bottom line idea, i.e. people, planet, profits, that sustainability is the principle of ensuring that our actions today do not limit the range of economic, social, and environmental options open to future generations. His goal was to, and his consultancy specifically works with corporations to try to deal with these issues. This was back in the late 1990s when he came up with this definition. So what is ESG? Just break it down. Environmental. In the real estate world, that's energy use, the amount of you're using, and the fuel source. Is it fossil fuel related or not? Greenhouse gas emissions because of that, waste, and materials use. Those are the main environmental impacts. Water's in there too. The social element is one that is not as well understood, but has certainly come into the fore, particularly with the onset of the pandemic. It's also becoming an issue. This is the effect that the real estate, the built environment has on its occupants, the employees of the tenants in the building, its communities, labor rights, workplace health and wellness, diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of these are the social element, and most strongly in the real estate world right now, we're seeing it play out in the healthy buildings and occupant experience realm. And governance. Here we have board diversity, ethical practices, shareholder rights, responsibility of the governance structure and to its stakeholders. So what's driving it? Well, there's regulatory issues. There's, first of all, buildings are responsible for something like 39% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's the second largest source behind transportation. California has passed through the Senate at least this Climate Accountability Act, which is for companies over $1 billion in sales, requires scope 1 through 3 emissions disclosure on greenhouse gases. That has not yet passed the House, but it's under consideration. A similar rule is going through the SEC right now and is, for not surprisingly, receiving significant resistance from fossil fuel interests. There is also resistance to it because of the expected cost of compliance with the SEC disclosure rules. Scope 1 emissions, if you're not familiar, are what you burn, what the electricity you use or the gas you use in the facility. Scope 2 emissions are getting that fuel to the site or that energy to the site. And scope 3 is your value chain. That's your customers, that's your suppliers. And that's where the rubber hits the road and where the real resistance is, because that could affect everybody. Large corporations have many suppliers and many customers, and they have to figure out what the emissions are for all of those. Outside of the regulatory world, we also have a demographic shift that's partly responsible for this value-driven investor. Millennials, for example, 75% of the global workforce by 2025 will be comprised of millennials. They will inherit something like $30 trillion, it's been estimated, from their baby boomer parents over the next 2 to 3 decades. That's all investable assets. They won't invest it all, but with what they do, they are 2 times as likely to invest based on social or environmental goals of the entity they're investing in than the general population. That is part of what's driving this shift in ESG investments, which have been estimated to be on track to a total of $53 trillion by 2025. So the other elements are risk mitigation. 79% of commercial real estate investors surveyed by PricewaterhouseCoopers believe ESG is a material risk that should be considered in their analysis. This includes both physical damage risk due to storms and changes in the climate, as well as transition risk. And we'll talk a little bit about what transition risk is. In real estate, that's essentially obsolescence. There's the business case. Being best in class if you score well, reducing operating expenses, employee retention, getting people to come to the office, value enhancement protection, superior returns, and avoiding the brown discount. Again, another way of saying obsolescence, when you can't green up your building or you can't become what the market wants. So what's the connection among all these things? When you look at it, E, S, and G, environmental, social, and governance, it seems like kind of a grab bag. But what connects them all is they're all externalities. It may not affect the top line if you don't address them, but it will definitely impact the bottom line if you ignore it. It's a total blind spot vulnerability, or can be. It can be an opportunity. And I think the important thing to think about it is that, or the important difference between all the other things that we consider in the valuation of real estate, is that ESG factors are the properties effects on the social and physical environment in which it operates. Almost everything else we do in real estate to value it is considering the effects of the outside market on the property when you think about it. These are the externalities that we have to consider and are now coming into the fore. This gives you an idea about where the activity is going on in ESG. So on the left-hand side, we have the private sector, federal, government, state, and local levels. I tried to break down here, where do you see it expressed? Where do you see ESG factors being expressed and how? And then on the top, we have environmental social governance. What's key here, you have to look, I mean, there's a lot of activity going on here, but what's key here is that the private sector is where most of this is going on. There are limited elements in the public sector regulatory. There's fewer of them. There's a lot of private sector stuff, and all the private sector is voluntary. And that's where it gets a little messy because it's hard to know what you need to comply with, who's going to require it, what reporting scheme you have to comply with. And it depends on who you are and who your investors are or who your stakeholders are. Actually, the other place that has been very active is the local level with green building codes and benchmarking, energy use reporting. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. Most of us are familiar with building labels in the green world. In residential, they're different everywhere you go in the country. There's very little similarity. There are a few that are nationwide, but they're very regionally diverse. In the commercial world, everyone's heard of LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. BREEAM was one that's actually preceded LEED in the UK and is more prevalent outside the US. Energy Star is one of the most successful brands I think there is in the environmental world. Rates everything from appliances to million square foot office buildings. There's other BOMA has a rating system now, sustainable building. IREM does. The more recent ones now are WELL and FitWell. And if you're not familiar with those, WELL is a WELL building standard. It's a privately developed, very rigorous standard for primarily commercial buildings that rates across. I'll show a slide in a second. It shows you the 9 different areas it rates. And then FitWell is one that's similar, but slightly less rigorous. Both are based on scientific studies. And so it's not a consensus-based thing so much as it is trying to figure out things that actually make a difference to people to help the occupant well-being, quality of life issues, et cetera. These two at the bottom, if we look at these, the top 4 really address the E and ESG, and the bottom 2 are the S, the social. You're seeing these kinds of stickers. Now, here's a good example of on the FitWell sticker. This is on an office building on Montgomery Street in San Francisco. Building health for all. So you get the equity, inclusion, fairness, all in a little forward snippet. Here's the academic or the kind of pretty example of the 9 area foundations of health in buildings that was developed by a guy named Joe Allen, who is at the T.H. Chan Center for School of Public Health at Harvard in 2017. And this has been developed, was primarily the foundation of the WELL building standard. What we see in action is this. This is snipped out of Boston Properties, which is a big REIT with primarily Class A office on the East and West Coast. This is out of their ESG report, what they're doing for the social aspect of buildings, the healthy buildings aim. Indoor air quality. What does it do? We want it to be good because it's good for cognitive performance, productivity, infectious disease transmission mitigation, clean air supply, thermal comfort. What is that? Why do we care about that? Productivity, healthy materials, remove contaminants from interior environment. I can go on. There's 2 more: pandemic-ready provisions for basically disaster preparedness, and green cleaning, because you want to minimize the impact of cleaning products on the people and the environment the people in that environment and the environment. This is just one example. It's snipped out of, I'm not picking out Boston Properties for any particular reason, but I thought this was a very cogent way of explaining what are they actually doing in these. And this is just one part of an ESG report. All right. So generally, the green building labels address site selection, energy use, water use, materials use, indoor environmental quality. That's the social element. Most of those others are environmental ones, operations and maintenance, and resilience. Resilience has kind of come into the fore as we've been starting to deal with more of these really, really severe storms that are unexpected and more frequent ones. We're also seeing things like green leases, which seek to align the needs and the desires of the parties in a lease transaction. So landlord wants to upgrade to a more efficient energy system. Tenant pays the utility bill, so they're going to benefit from the upgrade. The landlord is not going to benefit, so that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Why would the landlord go ahead and do that and spend the extra money to upgrade or do an energy efficiency upgrade when they're not going to benefit? Green lease seeks to get rid of that, what they call a split incentive, by creating a mechanism where the landlord can charge the tenant back for up to the amount they're saving on their electricity from that energy upgrade. Green mortgage, the agencies will provide lower rate financing. Green bonds are very marketable. There's a lot of questions about greenwashing in the green bond market as to what are these bonds really green, or are they just saying it? Similar thing has been going through the green building world. That's why there's green labels, but we don't really have green labels for green bonds yet, as far as I know. So that's where we're seeing it in the leasing and financing world. There's a whole series of reporting and benchmarking standards. These are just some of them. The Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, local benchmark and energy reporting, such as New York City laws 84 and 97. In 2009, New York City started requiring buildings over 25,000 square feet to report their energy use on an annual basis. That is available in an Excel file you can download from ever since they started collecting it for the last 5 or 7 years. I think it's available through 2018 right now. In 2019, they instituted another law, Local Law 97, that said, okay, here's the threshold. If you're over this threshold, you're going to have to pay a carbon tax of $260 or $368 per metric ton of carbon dioxide. So essentially what they created was a carbon tax. What we're seeing here with all of this is the process is first you got to measure it, then you can figure out how to reduce it by either imposing some sort of penalty or some sort of an incentive. But when you start seeing the benchmarking and reporting come in, it's that's the first step, and that's something to be aware of. All right, proposed SEC rule is in the news right now. It requires the publicly traded companies to disclose their entire climate change risk, much of which is tied to greenhouse gas emissions. Applies to publicly traded companies. Last I heard, it was going to exclude CMBS loans. But as far as I know, REITs will have to comply. Now, Kilroy, Boston Properties, I know Alexandria, a lot of them that I kind of follow, all have been producing and tracking that for some time. So I'm not sure that's going to be a huge issue for them in additional compliance. But it is going to be disruptive to have certainly scope 3 level emissions. That's going to be really tough because getting all that information from all your suppliers and what their climate risk is going to be a heavy lift. There's also the argument that scope 3 emissions are everybody else's scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we'll see where that goes. All right, resilience for a second. Let's talk about resilience. This is a little bit different because most of this other stuff is how the property is affecting the environment. Now we're talking about how does the property survive the onslaught of what we don't know is going to happen in the future. So this is from ULI, the ability to resilience definition, the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events, right? So you can't move real estate around. It's pretty much its definition. So you got to figure out a way to survive. This is a picture from Houston, a traffic camera in Houston after Hurricane Harvey hit in 2017, I think that was, yeah, 2017. That's you got to figure out a way to survive that or decide to relocate. Now, this is another pull quote out of that Nuveen ESG report, and I thought it was relevant, where they're talking about physical and transition risk. As noted in our environmental strategy, we recognize that the physical impacts of climate change will affect real estate values. Okay, so there's no debate here. We are also conscious that the transition to the low carbon economy presents both financial opportunities and risks. Effectively managing building efficiency and carbon intensity throughout this transition is a key factor in creating and protecting value in the assets we manage. So they're on top of it, and they put together what I thought was kind of interesting grid here, where they have transition risk on the left, the y-axis, and physical risk on the x-axis. Transition risk, remember, is the risk of obsolescence, or in the financial world, they talk about stranded assets at companies. We just look at it as obsolescence, either functional or external. And physical risk, obviously, is, well, damage, flooding, who knows, fires, whatever it is. Physical risk, incidentally, you can financially manage generally a lot more easily than transition risk or obsolescence. There may be no way to manage obsolescence if it's incurable. And I think it's interesting how this grid put it together, that if you have an orderly transition where climate goals are met, the physical risk is likely to be low. If they're not met, you're going to have high physical risk and physical losses. If we don't meet our goals, or we meet the goals, but it's in a disorderly way, there's going to be greater risk of obsolescence. And obviously, if the too little, too late world, if you don't meet the goals, you're gonna, and you miss the boat. That's where you have both obsolescence and significant physical risk. That's certainly the box you don't want to land in. MSCI, the reporting guys, put together, I pulled this from an example. This is just selected cities throughout the world, and they divided the green bars are, the light green bars are the transition risk, and the black bars are the physical risk, so the physical damage risk, right? And they ranked a number of cities around the world based on these, just as examples. And you can buy reports from them that'll break it down much more thoroughly than this. But what's significant is that in certain areas, for certain sea level rise, I mean, they've got 3 cities in the Netherlands, obviously, 2 cities in the Netherlands that are below sea level essentially, and are great physical risk of climate change from sea level rise. But there's a significant portion of risk involved in the transition. And that's where I think there's going to be a lot of focus, because again, that's something you can't financially manage by passing it off to others. The FEMA came out with a map recently, and a tool actually, which is a pretty interesting tool. They measure, this is a map and this is available to anybody who wants to use it, where they've mapped out by census tract across the country where the risks are to physical hazards, natural hazards, everything from floods, hurricanes, wildfires, you name it. It's maintained by FEMA. It evaluates 18 different categories. It also ranks social vulnerability, again, bringing in the social element of this, and community resilience, how well that community is prepared to come up with a score for all these areas. So that's that's the physical risk. And then the last thing I'll just kind of mention about is the construction cost inflation that's been going on long before the recent bout of inflation in the general market was knocking us out. And this goes to the point of, is it curable or incurable functional obsolescence if you've got to renovate your building to meet the needs of the new demands of under ESG? If you just look at it, the CPI was increased 18% in the 7-year period in San Francisco. This is a table out of one of my reports. Construction costs in that same period increased 57%, so over 3 times as fast. That's huge, 57% increase over 7 years. And in the pre-pandemic world, the delta between the CPI and the cost increases was even more. It was 8%, 8.4% CPI, 47% construction cost increase, so almost 6 times as much. That is going to be a significant risk, and it's already caught the attention of the insurance world. This is out of the Marsh Global Insurance Market Update from the first quarter of 2022. Valuation has become a focal point at virtually every renewal for all insurers, particularly related to concerns about the current inflationary environment, supply chain challenges, and labor shortages. Loss experience, where adjusted loss amounts were well above the reported values, has further heightened insurers' focus on this issue. Here's the insurance cost for a very large apartment project in the San Francisco Bay Area from 2019 to 2022. More than double. The insurance cost more than doubled between 2019 and 2022. That is significant. That's going to be expensive. That's going to be a value destructor, is insuring for these financial losses, whether you self-insure for them or you manage the risk on your own. All right, well, that's pretty much all that I have. I do have a couple of more. I have a case study slide, but I don't think we really need to go through that necessarily. That was pretty much all I had. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to take questions at this point.
I must say this was amazing. Thank you so much, Tim.
Well, thank you, Melanie. Very nice.
Yeah, you nailed it. You're able to pull from all these sources.
Well, yeah, the other thing I would add about this is, and this is kind of an evolving topic here, is that besides just changing the focus of the property on the environment, the other thing that we're dealing with right now is that this changes the focus from more towards the future, and towards a future that is more uncertain than it has been in the past. Because if you look at it, it is much more likely that the future will be unlike the past than it has ever been, certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah.
It's becoming clear that the environment itself is changing. The other thing is we're having a huge demographic shift. True, we all hear about the millennials, but also the majority, the country is becoming a majority minority country. And for the last 250 years, all of the decisions we've made up to this point have been made by Northern European males, and it's not going to be the case in the future. So and that's where all this pressure from diversity, equity, inclusion, look at there's tectonic shifts here coming on both the demographic side and the environmental side that are going to mean that if we base all of our decisions and our choices and expectations on what we know or knew to be the case, I think there's a big risk of missing it.
You always have these great abbreviations. You said majority, minority.
I didn't make that up.
That's great. What would you advise us appraisers? I mean, you are one as well, to educate ourselves on, and especially the sport, which may be able to, have some influence at the Appraisal Institute as to what appraisers should learn.
Well, I've long felt that some sort of green education ought to be mandatory for appraisers, but I know that nobody likes to be the big boogeyman and say you got to do it. But as I was telling, I'm teaching a class right now on practical applications in appraising green commercial buildings, and I started it out by saying, you're probably appraising green buildings and you don't even know it, because if you can't recognize this stuff, that's where it starts. That's what I realized when we tried to define a green building when we wrote the book. It's like, well, there isn't one, and there isn't really a universal. I mean, you kind of know it when you see it, but maybe not. It depends on the market. But what you can see are features that affect value, and you can also see properties that are better positioned to withstand what could be a very uncertain future, or maybe in some areas it won't be as bad as others, but we don't know. So that would be. I think that there's a potential for a competency gap, shall we say, if we don't get the Gen Pop up to speed. It's kind of like what we're dealing with the DEI stuff. I think that people need to kind of have that eye-popping moment. And I don't know, when with the discussion that was going on earlier, this doesn't exactly fall in squarely into ESG, but the best book I've read on the topic lately is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. If anybody's read that, or it's eye-opening to
Color
me.
of Law?
What's that?
The Color of Law?
Yeah, let me
Yes.
show it here. Yeah, I'll show you. I'll put it on screen here. Hold on a second. Okay, here it is. Here. And what he does is instead of shaking his finger at people for making bad decisions about land use patterns, he traces puts the blame on the government essentially, and says, look, that they had policies for years that were driven by racist behaviors. I mean that this is way oversimplifying, but it's remarkable. And for my entire career, I've wondered, why do we have, why are these particular areas minority areas? Why are these areas not? And when you start to unwind it all, whether it's zoning laws or it was FHA mandates or whatever, or bank financing requirements, it's like, holy cow. And I'm just done an assignment I'm working on in San Jose right now. I was pulling up grant deeds or looking through the prelims, and they had covenants, conditions, and restrictions recorded back in 1920 in this little subdivision. And it said that the last one, it said you couldn't put a garage, a barn, or an outhouse anywhere except at the back of the yard. You had to be at least, I can't remember the house had to be, I don't know, there were certain requirements. And then it said, and it may not be sold to anyone who is not of the Caucasian race. It's still, and now that's not enforceable, it hasn't been for years. But that's how our land use patterns, part of why our land use patterns developed the way they did. And it's pretty eye-opening. Anyway.
Now,
Very interesting.
Tim, I have a question. So I appreciate the work that you're doing here. This is awesome. And I agree with you. There's going to be a competency gap as we move forward. The large bank space has been playing in this, has been in this space now for years. When's it going to start to trickle down into the independent banks, the smaller banks, to where they're going to start having the eye on sustainability, sustainable lending? Do you have any foresight into that?
I don't. I'm trying to think of an analog. Other than a regulation that requires it. I mean, that's kind of what the Community Reinvestment Act was supposed to be doing, right? It was supposed to be forcing banks to invest in underserved communities. Am I understanding that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I don't know I think that when they see the big banks doing it, they may, by example or by necessity, to compete or to be relevant, they may do it, but I don't have a good answer for that.
Okay.
I'm afraid I know.
Yeah, I mean, it will become important to appraisers when it becomes important to the users of appraisal services, right? And you can't have one without the other. So I'm hopeful, right? And that, that there has been progress made, and there are a lot more people on board with this whole process than there were 5 years ago. We still have a lot of work to do. That's for sure.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is that along that line is I work with the local chapter here in the Bay Area of the Appraisal Institute, and we a very active chapter. It's a large chapter, and we have a lot of people who are very dedicated. And I will tell you, when I bring up, for example, the topics, I've been speaking on the green topics for years. There's never been more interest than now. The diversity, equity, inclusion thing, the bias case, that's right across. I mean, I can look out my window to Sausalito and Marin City, where that famous case is, that property is located. That is an area of great interest. And I think to the extent that AI can put out those programs that are going to educate in a way that doesn't shake a finger and say you're a bad person because you're white and male, and this is it's your fault, and say no, look, this is I know AI has got that program underway. Stephanie Cohen, but Don Malter Gingrich, when I took the USPAP course, did an excellent job of presenting on that issue and saying, hey, we all have biases, it's preferences. The problem is we can't let them, behave, infect our judgment or whatever. And for appraisers, that's a challenge because we're paid to opine on things and stick to it. And we're used to looking in the rearview mirror. All of this stuff requires appraisers to do more of the looking forward, looking outward, and seeing what's going on, not just, check the market report, look at the MLS and look at Redfin, whatever it is, look in the rearview mirror, wait for the comps to prove it. That's not going to work in the future. We got to be more proactive.
Mhm. It would be great also to have more conversations with land use planners who actually plan where zoning goes or how it evolves. I don't know if you guys have any contacts there into that industry, or is the Urban Land Institute one? Maybe to start.
So Tim, I have a question for you.
Yeah, Doug.
So, and this ties into what Melanie just said. I think one of the things in terms of governance concepts for the future to create greater resiliency, as well as to help combat the problems of racial bias and geographic and social, spatial segregation, economic segregation by geography, is the fact that most of the communities in the United States now are so fragmented between jurisdictional governance structures that they can basically play each other off of each other in ways that weak communities can't really have an equitable stake in the future, because rich communities where everybody has moved to isolate themselves basically can cut them off. And the problem with urban planners is that they work for government organizations and they basically are mandated to assist their local government and not necessarily follow a mandate for a larger structural governance. And I think it's going to be very difficult for people to sacrifice their local autonomy in favor of greater goods. That's just going to be an issue that's going to rise very prominently, because we're basically allowing growth to, especially in a flat demographic, where we don't have a lot of new population input occurring to take up the slack. This is going to make it very difficult. Somebody's ox is going to get gored in this, and communities with resources don't have any inherent interest in sacrificing their superior position in favor of greater social equity, greater environmental equity.
Yeah, I do agree with that. California is kind of a interesting case. We have, I don't know, it's so dysfunctional in so many ways. But the state has actually stepped in and taken away some of the authority of local governments to control their own land use decisions. They simply, used their sovereignty to step in and say, no, if this project meets these requirements, you can get this many exceptions from any of the zoning rules. And if it's, by the way, if it also does this much affordable housing, then your role is reduced to ministerial, and there is no discretion. This in a state that is famous for stopping everything, people using CEQA to stop everything, right? And at the same time, we've got, all the Atherton, which one of the richest zip codes in the United States, all the tech titans there. They just shot down the idea of somebody trying to do townhouses in that community, where I think there's a minimum lot size of 5 acres or something. I don't know. It's like it's. And it doesn't help that we're becoming more polarized economically, where there's less of a middle and there's more at the extremes. That's another demographic problem we're having. So I agree, it's going to be a real challenge. On the other hand, I can think of communities in my market here in the Bay Area where they're fine with higher density housing. Redwood City is an example. That's literally next door to Menlo Park. It has historically been more of a middle, for the Bay Area, middle income area, but they transformed their downtown from a dying little small town downtown where they've got 9-story, apartment buildings and condos and everything else, very high density, mixed income stuff. There's some inclusionary in that. So there's areas where I think where it'll work, and there's areas where it's going to get huge resistance. I could not agree with you more.
I think
Alice,
Alice has
sorry.
a question.
Thank you so much. And Tim, thanks for doing this. Back to the ESG specifically, I certainly agree that education is super important here. And I think that when you look at Europe and where they are and where US is, it's good to see that the US is now getting more focused. I think that the new prop tech companies and the way that we are collecting and measuring data is helping bring this to light with investors on how to think of, to your point, the have and the have-nots of brown versus not. What will be in demand? What will you pay? What is the price? And while all of the ESG is not about price, right? It's all about the things you've talked about here. I was a little surprised at a meeting I was in. They said, when are the appraisers starting to show this? And it's the appraisers who need to do this. And I was thinking, it's really not the appraisers. Of course, the education is, but it's the investors, right? It's the brokers, it's the communities, right? Because comps do matter. And the comps will show whether there are less investors, more investors, what price they'll pay, what kind of underwriting are you doing in these climate areas, or because of local law, or whatever it is. So I just wonder, as you were speaking and saying that the appraisers needed to be proactive. In my mind, they need to be proactive, educating your subject property, educating about the comps, educating the reader and the client about the neighborhood, et cetera. I don't know that I feel the appraiser should be making pricing adjustments, right, without knowing how unless it's factual things, right? But so I just was curious of your opinion as you were talking about the appraisers needed to be doing something first, where I think they need to do something, but I'd be cautious that they're making, arbitrary adjustments, positive or negative, without data.
Oh yeah, no, I would never advocate that, and if that came through, that was not intended at all. No, it's not that appraisers should go out and make adjustments and show the world how this value is there. That's not our job. We're supposed to observe and report. But the problem, there's scientific data on this, that if you don't expect to see something, you won't. You may just miss it. And certainly if you don't recognize, you don't know what the equipment is or the features. That's the point. Is appraisers need to be recognized that the world is changing. And another example that is that, go look at the ESG reports from these real estate companies. I mean, CoStar put one out. Cushman and Wakefield. It's like a de rigueur thing now. And when you look at what they're actually paying attention to, why are they doing that? It's not because it's cheap or fun. It's because their stakeholders, primarily their investors and their competitors, are doing it. It matters to the market. That's market evidence right there, whether it's a price adjustment or not. And when you look at the kinds of assets that these market leading companies hold, that tells you where the market is going to go in the future, toward that, in that direction, or they wouldn't be doing it. Those are the smartest people in the room. That's where I think appraisers need to be doing, is sticking up their antenna, putting stuff into their brain to learn, see where the market's at, and not just expecting things to be always the way they were before. Then see if there's then you'll be in a position to accurately judge if there is a market influence that you need to consider.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I am thinking that it is in my mind, the appraiser does the analysis, right? And they report. And if there is an adjustment, they'll support with their data. The comps and the and what you see where the investors are, rates of return, et cetera, will give you a piece of that if you can find transparency into those comps, right? So I do agree the appraisers are doing, I think they're actually doing a lot of the same. They're just doing it in a different way, using different technology and asking different questions, because that is what potentially, is what the investors are doing. And so the appraisers should be reflecting. Anyway, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Wait, and Ken, you had a question?
Ken, you're on mute.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, I thought it was interesting. The ESG is very much like environmental efficiencies, right? High performance buildings. State of Florida did the anti-ESG, right, policy for their pension fund, which is and how these can be politically charged. I think it's really important that the AI and any education efforts on this stress how important it is that we as appraisers are agnostic and apolitical in our observations, right? And I saw the resistance early on to green buildings from a lot of appraisers, because they just thought that this was just some newfangled thing that no one's going to pay attention to. And I see, I think there's jeopardy here that ESG can be viewed that way to some people, to some in the appraisal community. So I think there needs to be, strong efforts on the part of the organization to make sure that we are presenting this as something that is agnostic and apolitical, and this is what we need to be aware of because the marketplace is recognizing this.
Yes, very good point. And it is an issue about, it is going to be politicized. It is already politicized. It is already politicized. It's being weaponized for political reasons. What we're looking at though is market behaviors. And if everybody's doing this, all the smart money's on paying attention to this and reporting on this, and their investors are doing this, then I think it's kind of beginning to speak for itself. We're going to get resistance. Everything's politicized right now, and everything is, you pick a side and everything right now. Right now, I think the issue is which way is the right side. However it's presented, that's going to be tricky. It's going to be difficult to navigate that. I agree, and absolutely everything needs to be agnostic and avoid the politicization of it to the extent possible. Well, that should be avoided at all costs. I agree. But the activity that's going on here, there's too much going on, in my opinion, to ignore it. And I think we're going to start to see requirements to either appraisers are going to have to, lenders are going to have to, whatever, report on these issues to various stakeholders.
Tim, to that point, the Appraisal Institute has published a commercial green and energy efficiency addendum. It's been on the street for several years. Is that something that you see being relevant here? An exercise that appraisers could go through to illustrate their competency on the topic?
I don't know. I think, the problem with forms and commercial appraisers is they don't really understand each other. It's hard to get a form that works for every commercial property, and commercial property appraisers generally do narrative reports and don't really look at forms. So I think there's a role for that. I have to think about if that's the way to do it, or I mean, we may. I don't know. I haven't. I don't do as much lender work as I used to, and I don't know if any lenders are starting to mandate that some sort of a checklist or form be filled out on that matter. So that's another area that where it may come through. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, I think it is typically driven by the client for sure.
How about like just a checklist? If we could come up with some, like all the stuff that you just had in your list of things for appraisers maybe to pay attention to know what they need to look for. Is there anything of that nature that's been thought of? I know for us, we use an environmental checklist for their appraisers to fill out to, every time they go to the site, just to note different problems that may be environmentally sensitive.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
not-
just like the sign you showed on that door, there's probably many appraisers that walked right in and never saw it.
Right, right. Or not know what the heck it has and to do with it. It's like, what is this about?
Right.
What's a healthy building? That's the first question everyone asks. What's a healthy building? It's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the commercial addendum was intended as a form of a checklist, and a research tool, essentially. I just posted it in the chat if you want to take a look at it.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely. We should maybe think as the client advisory board, what should be done or could be done in terms of education.
I think that the
anything.
addendum might be a good starting point to at least consider what kinds of things.
That's amazing.
I guess
I haven't seen that yet.
Well, the addendum was really an evolution from the residential side because we had requests for research and analysis of this issue in single family.
Mhm.
And I think there was a team that I remember, I think Deutsche Bank was involved with it at one point, reviewing the document. So it had a little bit of client input. And I mean, Sandra Adamatis is on the line. Maybe she can explain where that came from, the origin of it, and the development of it. You have to take yourself off mute, Sandy.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yeah, when I wrote the residential green addendum, I started having commercial appraisers saying, can you do one for commercial, because it would make a nice checklist for us.
Mhm.
And originally we had decided not to do that because most appraisers on the commercial side do narratives. But this is more of a checklist for them, whether they put it in the report or not.
Maybe for banks, it would be nice to say, oh, our real estate is always being assessed, on a certain scale of environmental. Yeah, I don't know what rating, social and governance. It's just something to think about.
I mean, Melanie, to that point, I do think that if a client included the commercial green addendum in the scope of service request, then they may be able to make a statement like that or to that effect for their regulators.
I'm gonna speak to my ESG person in my office and see what she thinks.
Yeah, I am aware of a few commercial lenders that said that when they are talking to a borrower, an investor, and they mention that their property is energy efficient or green, they've handed them the green addendum, said fill this out, have it available for the appraiser. So that ideally, that's the great communication tool that can be used between the lender and the appraiser.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Yeah, and we can expand this in the future for social and governance if needed.
Yeah, that's the one thing I don't see the focus on, and that's because that's become a new development, really, the social emphasis in particular. Governance, there's not a ton in real estate, because when you're appraising a piece of real estate, there's not a lot of governance going on. That's usually at the entity level. Okay. Unless I'm missing something, if anybody else wants to pop in on that. There's some policies and things that could be, but I mean, if you're appraising an asset, you're not assuming that the ownership goes along with the asset, right? It's the asset itself. So I don't know, but there may be things I'm not seeing there on the governance. I see it's
but it could be that the bank could say, oh, we are lending to, companies that have a high standard in this area, diversity. I'm just philosopher.
And that's where I think that's more of the underwriting level, right? Rather than the valuation of the individual asset.
Yeah, probably. I'm thinking a little bit beyond my scope,
Well, we're beyond our allotted time. I wanted to say thanks to Tim Runde for joining the Client Advisory Board this afternoon. Really appreciate his insights and leading our thoughtful discussion today. Thank you again, Tim.
You're welcome, and thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed it. It was I learned a lot myself. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.